We are embarking on the second book of the Bible, beginning the book of Exodus. And of course, inevitably, as we begin a new book and for the time being say goodbye to the first book, to Genesis, we ought to consider what has changed that dictates this as a new beginning in the Torah. There is undoubtedly a lot to be said with respect to why Genesis ends when it does, and perhaps in some future year we'll have an opportunity to speak about that aspect of the end of Genesis. But at this point, I'd like to focus upon what is taking place at the beginning of the book of Exodus. And as we consider the manner in which the book of Exodus begins, on the face of it, not only does it not seem to be a significant new beginning, it seems, quite frankly, to be a repeat of what we've already read. Specifically, the beginning of Exodus, that opening verse. These are the names of the sons or children of Israel who came into Egypt with Jacob. Every man came with his household. It seems almost verbatim to be a repetition of what we read in Genesis chapter 46, verse 8. These are the names of the sons or children of Israel coming to Egypt, Jacob and his sons. Almost exactly the same words. But in a sense, the very realization that we read almost the same passage with somewhat more detail back in Genesis chapter 46 helps to highlight why these words at the beginning of Exodus do indeed represent a critical new threshold. Genesis is, of course, the story of the patriarchs. And as such, indeed, we read the names of the sons of Jacob, the sons, the children of Israel in Genesis, because they, after all, are the bridge generation. To some degree, they're a little bit like patriarchs themselves, not actually patriarchs, but consider that one of the sons of Jacob, Joseph, fathered two tribes. So to a certain extent, everything, including the sons of Jacob in Genesis, pertains to patriarchs. Exodus represents a new threshold. It's all about the children. The expression that I have marked in red in both the Hebrew and in the English. In Hebrew, Bnei Israel. In English, sons or children of Israel, is an expression that appears in the book of Genesis exactly 7 times. It appears more than half that many times in just the opening verses of Exodus alone. Because indeed, we have reached the era of the children of Israel. Not the generations of the patriarchs, not that era, but this era. And that represents a crucial new threshold with many implications, not necessarily pleasant ones. The patriarchs, on the one hand, unquestionably faced many challenges, ongoing challenges, much distress. But while they faced these challenges, there was a very keen sense that they were doing so with God. Almost at the very beginning of our being introduced to Abraham, we read at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12 that God says to him, as we discussed, go you forth from your land, from your place of birth, from your father's house. Now, mind you, leaving all these behind is undoubtedly a tremendous challenge. But the challenge becomes an awful lot more bearable when you know God told you. You're doing it for God and with God together. As for Isaac and Jacob, they too, after all, were directly privy to divine revelation. God spoke with them. And even apart from that, they each grew up in the home of the prophet of the generation. Isaac growing up in the household of Abraham and Sarah, both of whom commune with God. Obviously, Jacob growing up in the house of Isaac and Rebekah, and moreover, by simple arithmetic, until he was age 15, he was also growing up with his grandfather Abraham. So again, they faced challenges, but challenges with very keen sense that they were facing them with God. And in contrast, on the other hand, the era of the children. No dramatic manifestations of God's presence. If anything, of course, very much the contrary. What we read in Exodus chapter 1, there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph or didn't want to know Joseph, pretended to not know Joseph. And he has a problem with this nation, this emergent nation, the children of Israel. They've become too many, too mighty. Come, let us deal wisely or shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and therefore they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. Not only is God's presence not dramatically manifest for the children of Israel in this era, but if anything, it is painfully concealed, hidden. They don't see God's presence at all. And of course, inevitably, on that note, this book of the Bible embarks with special implications to them, the era of the children, and inevitably special implications to us. Because when everything is clear, when everything is shining, when everything is bright and well clarified, there may be a set of challenges, but it's a very different set of challenges. I think we can commiserate all the more with an era in which everything is dark, murky, vague, unclear, and God's presence is nowhere obvious. And it is then in this context that we continue in Exodus chapter 1. The Egyptians made the children of Israel enslaved with body-breaking labor, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and in brick, in all manner of service in the field, and all their service wherein they made them serve with rigor. And then we read a fascinating episode. the first, I think, of several episodes of heroism. But mind you, heroism in the Bible's version of what heroism truly is. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of the one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. Remember, this is the king of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. This is not just the most powerful person in that most powerful empire in the ancient world, because after all, the king of Egypt isn't even perceived as a person. He's perceived as a god. And he says, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, you shall look upon the birth stool. If it be a son, then kill him. We can rest pretty well assured that the king of Egypt was not at all used to being disobeyed. But the midwives feared God. God, as we render it with a capital G in English. Not the God, lowercase g, that was Pharaoh. They feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the children. And the king called to the midwives, and he said to them, why have you done this thing and have saved the children? Why have you disobeyed orders? So the midwives give an answer. They tell Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, they are lively, that is, they've already given birth before the midwife comes to them. What isn't recorded here is exactly how the king responded to the excuse of the midwives. What is recorded here, however, is two other consequences of this story. One, we can well imagine, was certainly at the time completely invisible. And God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty, and it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. What houses? The Bible doesn't say. We have a tradition, I'll get to that shortly, that the houses here refer to the house of the priesthood and the house of royalty in Israel. But again, the Bible doesn't specify, nor, when all is said and done, would we expect it to, because let's be realistic. These houses were completely undiscernible at this time. This is a promise, but a promise that doesn't have any obvious expression in their lives and times at this point. The other consequence of this story, which is the last verse of the chapter, is clearly much more tangible. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born cast into the river. In other words, the midwives aren't handling it, we'll do it ourselves. So the flesh and blood eyes, what did the midwives accomplish? Sad to say, on the face of it, very little, perhaps nothing. Pharaoh will have his way, one way or the other. Ironically, in a sense, this is, of course, a kind of restatement of our conclusion from last time. When we choose, we don't choose ultimate consequences in the world. We choose whether, by our exercise of our free will, we ally ourselves with God or attempt to oppose God. The divine plan will advance regardless. But if someone chooses to oppose the plan, what he will in fact have accomplished is he will have destroyed himself. Whereas when we ally ourselves with God's plan, it is ourselves whom we save. So, of course, to that extent, the midwives, we are told, are ultimately rewarded by God. But I think there's an additional crucial message that emerges, ironically, from the very fact that on an obvious, this worldly plane, we aren't really told that the midwives accomplished much of anything. And that lesson is to be truly a hero does not entail being successful and figuring out what's going to be the most successful course to follow in this world. Because we're not the ones ultimately who call those shots. God is. To be a hero means to choose to be right by God, irrespective of the consequences. To do what's right because it is right. Period. Notice the difference between what hero means in the Bible and what, for example, being a hero meant in ancient Greek mythology. I use that as an example because it is, after all, so emblematic of what the pagan view of heroism was. Worldly greatness, accomplishment, and most of all, making a name for yourself. And here's where I need to note an additional nuance in this story. And this is the sort of point that I have to admit, once again, you really need the Hebrew to appreciate. And that is, as you may have noted, I specifically indicated the names of the midwives, Shifra and Puah. They may be names. Tantalizingly, however, they may not. They may be titles or descriptions. Because, as we have already noted on a number of occasions in the past, in classic Hebrew, all words derive from three-letter roots. Let's consider the roots of these names and what they mean. Shifra in the Hebrew, as you could see, Shifra, for those of you who are fluent in the language, has the three-letter root of Shin, Pei, Resh. When we consider its appearances in the Bible, I can cite three examples in the Bible. The first, the blessing of Naphtali, that was actually just 2 chapters ago in Genesis chapter 49. Naphtali is a hind let loose. He gives, in the Hebrew, Imre Shafel, which we could alternatively render as goodly words, words of beauty, pleasant sayings. As you can see, Shafel, from the same root as Shifra, can be rendered as goodly, beautiful, pleasant. Similarly, in Psalm chapter 16, the lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have in the Hebrew, Nachalat Shafra Alai, a goodly or beautiful or pleasing heritage. Shafra again from the root of Shifra. And finally, in the book of Job, by his breath the heavens are, in the Hebrew, Shifra. This actually is the self-same spelling and pronunciation of the midwife's name or title or description. And we can render that in English as, by his breath the heavens are serene, beautified, perfected. All aspects of a faithful midwife's job, ensuring that everything in the birth goes well and that in tending to the newborn baby, everything is serene, beautified, perfected, pleasing, all part of the job description. That's with respect to the first midwife. As for the second midwife, Pu'ah, the root letters here, Pei, Ein, Hey, for those who are fluent in Hebrew. Here we can cite a verse in Isaiah that is even more explicitly associated with childbirth. I have long time held my peace. I have been still and refrained myself. Now will I cry like a travailing, birthing woman. In the Hebrew, keyoleda if coming from the same root as pu'ah. And again, we can't help but note, these names may in fact be shrouds of anonymity, because knowing what the true names of these midwives were is really inconsequential. What's important is what they did. What's important is not their name on this worldly level of greatness. What's important is being right by God. And they were. This is our first story of heroism in Exodus. The next story is the story of Exodus chapter 2. But to appreciate the significance of this story and this heroism, it is useful for us to repeat that closing verse of chapter 1. The closing verse was Pharaoh charging all of his people, every son that is born cast into the river. And the next verse we read, and there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime or clay and with pitch. And she put the child therein and laid it in the flags, the reeds by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now, before we consider the content of this story at greater length, note at the outset a very strange tension here, almost a seeming contradiction. What do we see in verse 1? A man of the house of Levi took to wife a daughter of Levi. Newlyweds, and they have a child. But wait a second, they already have a child. They have a daughter, a sister of this newborn baby who is old enough to stand by and see what is done to her baby brother and even intervene, as we will see shortly in the continuation of the chapter. What's going on here? In our tradition, the explanation derives very clearly from what we saw in the previous verse at the end of chapter 1. That when Pharaoh charged all his people, every son that is born cast in the river, this couple reached the seemingly inevitable conclusion. What's the point of building a family? Family life will lead to children, and having children will just lead to tragedy. Any sons we have will meet such a horrible fate. There's no point in going on anymore. So they separated themselves to avoid having children. And it is in the wake of that decision that we appreciate how profoundly heroic this verse is. There went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. That on further consideration, I should note that we have an ancient tradition that it wasn't just further consideration, it was the instigation of the unnamed daughter, the sister yet to be of this newborn baby, who prodded her parents to come together again. Because if we succumb to an evil king's decrees, then we become accomplices in those evil decrees. And so the heroism is, we're going to continue business as usual, come what may. Why? Because it's right. Not because we know the consequences, not because we know what we'll accomplish, but because all that matters is to be right by God, irrespective of the consequences. That's heroism. And again, that's heroism not to make a name for ourselves. There aren't any names here. Just an anonymous man of the house of Levi, a daughter of Levi, and the sister. That's it. We aren't given any further information as to their identities. It doesn't matter. Heroism is not to make a name for ourselves. It's to be right with God. And God knows. This becomes strikingly all the more glaring a message of the Bible when we consider the fact that we do know their identities. We know exactly who these people are. Because after all, we know the identity of the baby. That becomes clear from the continuation of the chapter. This baby is Moses. Well, we don't have to go too far. Indeed, we just have to go to chapter 6 to read in the genealogy of the tribe of Levi that one of Levi's sons was Kehat, and one of his sons was Amram, and Amram took him Yocheved, his father's sister, to wife, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and therefore Moses' parents were not some anonymous man of the house of Levi marrying a daughter of Levi, but rather Amram and Yocheved. We know their names. As for the supposedly anonymous sister, we know her name too, in Exodus chapter 15. And Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her. This is after the parting of the sea in celebration. Miriam is the sister of Aaron. Aaron is brother of Moses. So the sister's name is Miriam. And indeed, in Numbers chapter 26, we see the whole family explicitly laid out for us to read about them. We read that Kehat begat Amram, and the name of Amram's wife was Yocheved, and she bore unto Amram, Aaron, and Moses, and Miriam, their sister. No ambiguity at all. Just for good measure, I'll also point out that we have the self-same identification in Chronicles that the sons of Kehat include Amram, and the children of Amram are Aaron and Moses and Miriam. So we know exactly who these people are. So if we know, why in the world did the story have to be told to us anonymously? We're going to find out shortly exactly who these people were. Why did a man of the house of Levi, a daughter of Levi, an anonymous sister? Because, again, we're reading stories of heroism and appreciating what it means to be a hero. It doesn't matter what their names were. Heroism is defined in terms of what you do, not who you are. What you choose, not what do you accomplish. And so, the story is anonymous. But the heroes do what is right by God. This anonymity becomes all the more striking in the continuation of this story, the third profile of heroism that we read at the beginning of Exodus, in verse 5 of chapter 2. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, and she saw the ark among the flags, among the reeds, and sent her handmaid to fetch it, and she opened it and saw it, even a child, and behold, the boy that wept, and she had compassion on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maiden went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, just consider that in these 6 verses, we encounter 5 times reference to the daughter of Pharaoh, and not once reference to her name. Imagine if I were telling you a story. 5 times I refer to a person by relationship. Wouldn't you expect me to tell you first time what the name is? Then afterwards, of course, I don't need to repeat the relationship. I can just use the name. It's far more efficient. The fact that the Bible goes out of its way to maintain her anonymity, I submit to you, is further amplifying this very message. The name isn't what matters. It's the deeds that matters. And indeed, when we consider her deeds, at the outset she says, this is one of the Hebrews' children. She knows very well what her father decreed. And the courage to say, I don't care. I am following my conscience, not my father, not my supposedly divine, royal father. The irony that the most glaring violation of Pharaoh's decree came from his own daughter. And she needs a nursemaid. She could, of course, try to conceal the child's identity, but when the child's sister offers to call a Hebrew woman to be the nursemaid, Pharaoh's daughter says, go, get a Hebrew woman. After all, it's one of the Hebrews' children. And she even pays the wages of this nursemaid to nurse her adoptive son. And indeed, far from concealing what she has done, She actually accentuates it. She calls the child Moses because I drew him out of the water. Well, everyone presumably knew who was getting thrown into the water. So far from concealing the fact that she had adopted as her son one of the Hebrew children, she flaunts it. She does what's right, and she doesn't care about the consequences. And of course, in a sense, this is the most heroic act, because this is heroism on behalf of a stranger, another nation, a nation that she was indoctrinated to view as the enemy, but she still has a sense of what is right, and she follows it. And that's all that's important for us to know, not her name. And again, of course, I can't help but stress the glaring contrast to Greek heroism, making a name for oneself, worldly greatness. I think it's instructive for us to consider in this regard another episode much earlier on in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. When the people say, let's make brick, burn them using brick for stone, clay for mortar, and they announce their plan. Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. Now we know we relate to the Tower of Babel not as a positive development. But when you consider what it was that they were saying, where's the crime? They don't want to be scattered? Nothing wrong with that. Oh yes, this is the crime. And let us make us a name. When you obsess on making a name for yourself, that means you're forgetting about what life truly is for. If you allow me to share with you a story that I think helps to illustrate this point well. This from the introduction of Eli Wiesel's Legends of Our Time. These words were written quite a long time ago, approximately 20 years after Wiesel survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald. The old, white, bearded rabbi looked at me disapprovingly. So it's you, he sighed. You are Dodje Fege's grandson. He had recognized me at once, which both pleased and embarrassed me. I have not been so identified since my childhood, since the war. 20 years have elapsed since he last saw me. We were still in Hungary. My mother brought me to him to obtain his blessing. Now we were alone in the room, in a suburb near Tel Aviv. And for some reason I felt more uncomfortable than then. He sat in his armchair and studied me. He had not changed much. His face remained friendly and pained. His smile contained all the wisdom in the world. Dodje Fege's grandson, the Rebbe repeated as if to himself. His eyes were resting upon me, and I wondered whom he saw. Rebbe, I said, I have been working hard to acquire a name for myself. Yet to you, I am still attached to my grandfather's. It was a poor attempt to break the tension. So that's what you've been doing all these years, he remarked. He nodded his head and added, "What a pity." Indeed. When our concern is to make a name for ourselves, what we lose is our true identity. We lose our true identity because, as we discussed last time, everyone comes into the world with a mission, a God-given mission, to do something, to fix up something in the world. And it is through our fulfilling that God-given mission that underlies our lives that we discover our true identity. And it is by obsessing on making a name for ourselves that we lose our true identity. So when we consider the Torah's stories of heroism, in particular, in the era of the children, there are no names. There are deeds. There is commitment, devotion to fixing up whatever it is that we can fix up in the world, not making a name for ourselves. Rather, on the contrary, it is, I think, instructive for us to consider the message in the third and final chapter of the prophet Malachi, which is the final chapter of the prophets. The prophet tells his people in the name of God, "Your words have been all too strong against me." And you say, "Wherein have we spoken against you?" You have said, "It is vain to serve God. And what profit is it that we have kept his charge, and that we have walked mournfully or submissively before the God of hosts? And now we call the proud happy." That is, we regard the wicked as fortunate. They that work wickedness are built up. They try God and are delivered and escape. And then says the prophet, "Then they that feared God spoke with one another, and God hearkened and heard. And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared God and thought upon his name." Book of remembrance? What book of remembrance? Perhaps the answer is the book of history. Because ultimately, when you dedicate yourself to God, you write your page in history. Not by remonstrating about how it is vain to serve God and how it doesn't accomplish anything and you haven't gotten anywhere and of course you haven't made a name for yourself, but rather recognizing that is the permanent acquisition. That being right by God means being inscribed in God's book of remembrance, that book of history. And by consequence, the prophet adds, "Then you will again discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him who serves God and him who serves him not." The division between the righteous and the wicked is fairly straightforward. Those who are deliberately allying themselves with God's plan and those who are attempting to thwart it. But even among those who are presumably righteous, there are still those who truly serve God and those who really don't. They may not be criminals. They may be doing nothing wrong, but they're also not doing a whole lot right. That dedication, that relentless dedication to do what is right because it is right, period. That is the hallmark of a true, faithful servant of God, the son who serves his father faithfully. These stories are all in the first verses of the book of Exodus. And I suspect that they all serve collectively as an introduction for what follows: the early biography of Moses. I should point out here that of the three stories of heroism that we have just discussed, two of them explicitly have to do with the formative influences on Moses. After all, the second story of heroism was about the parents of Moses and his older sister. The third story of heroism was about Moses' adoptive mother, the daughter of Pharaoh. I'll add that we have an ancient tradition that the first story of heroism is also about the formative influences on Moses. Remember our observation that the names Shifra and Puah may not be names, may simply be titles or descriptions. Descriptions of whom? Again, the Torah doesn't tell us, because in understanding what it means to be a hero, it doesn't matter. But we have an ancient tradition that Shifra is in fact none other than Yocheved by different name, Moses' mother. And Puah is identified either as Moses' sister, Miriam, or his sister-in-law, the wife-to-be of his older brother Aaron. So, of course, ironically, since the Torah is reticent about identities here, we discern in the identities formative influences on Moses. And we consider the opening episodes of the biography of Moses. First, he went out to his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he smote the Egyptian. He didn't make any calculations of effectiveness. We will yet consider what the meaning is of he saw there was no man. Give me a few more minutes and we'll get back to it. But for now, his smiting the Egyptian was because he saw evil perpetrated. And he's not going to keep silent. He acts much as, remember the midwives? Shifra and Puah see evil being decreed in the person of the king of Egypt, telling them to kill the boys. And they don't obey. They don't acquiesce. Here too, Moses sees evil being perpetrated and he doesn't acquiesce. He doesn't maintain silence. He kills the Egyptian. That's episode number 1. And he went out the second day, and behold, 2 men of the Hebrews were striving together. And he said to him that did the wrong, "Why are you smiting your fellow?" Quite a busybody, you might think. But then, again, if you can't abide by seeing injustice perpetrated, by seeing wrongs being committed, you don't remain silent, you intervene. The second episode is, if you will, an internal family matter within the emergent nation of Israel. Just as the second episode of Heroism was also a family matter. Amram and Yocheved restarting their family in the face of the horrific decree that they were attempting to thwart by living life as normal. Moses, too, within the family, shows the heroism of doing what is right, irrespective of where it might lead. And of course, we know where it led. It led to talebearers conveying to Pharaoh that Moses had killed one of his taskmasters, and Pharaoh sought to slay Moses. And Moses flees to the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now, under these circumstances, it doesn't take too much imagination to consider the predicament in which Moses finds himself. He has, if you will, stuck his nose in a bit too many places, gotten a bit too involved in other people's problems, and as a result, he's running for his life. He's now in Midian. So you'd think he would kind of keep quiet because, after all, he's gotten himself into enough trouble already. And what happens? He's sitting by the well, and the Torah tells us that the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water, filled the troughs to water their father's flock, and the shepherds came and drove them away. Now, Moses doesn't even know the story here. They're all strangers to him, and talk about being outnumbered. He doesn't have any friends to speak of. And he stood up and helped them and watered the flock. The Hebrew reads not just that he helped them, but rather, Vayoshian. He saved them. He ganged up by himself on a whole group of shepherds, where his only allies were the girls. Doesn't sound like a particularly safe strategy, does it? And of course, inevitably, the answer is it may not be safe, but he doesn't care. Nor does he care that he is a stranger in a strange land, and these are people who aren't even related to him and have nothing to do with him, and he's never seen them before. He does what's right. Why? Because it's right. Where's it going to lead? What's it going to accomplish? Irrelevant. He does what's right because it's right. Period. Just as third episode of Heroism that we discussed at the outset, the daughter of Pharaoh intervenes to save a strange baby from strange people with whom she may have had no contact heretofore at all. Again, why? Because it is right. And the fact that that little baby is from a different people and a total stranger is just as irrelevant as to Moses, the fact that the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, are strangers and from a different people. It doesn't enter into the equation. All that enters into the equation for the true hero is doing what is truly right. Moses acts, we've noted this already, but it behooves us to emphasize the point here as well, in much the same vein that the Torah warns us. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. Because when you are silent in the face of evil, you are an accomplice with evil. Likewise, we have noted in Deuteronomy chapter 22 the story of the betrothed damsel who is raped in a vacant area in a field, as opposed to if it happened in a city, the difference being very simply that if it's in a vacant field, we realize she was screaming, but there was none to save her. If she would have been raped in a city, she could have called for help. Because it is axiomatic that if you hear a cry for help, you will answer it. Because it's the right thing to do. Not because of any other considerations. So the only tenable circumstance in which no one came to help her is because she was in a field. And no one was within earshot. Otherwise, of course, someone would have come to save her. You don't stand idly by. I believe we have had occasion in the past to mention the comment of Edmund Burke, the British historian, in writing regarding the French Revolution: all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And indeed, the Torah's mandate is to do something. Whatever is right, irrespective of consequences. To not become an accomplice in evil. Because if we are silent, we are allowing evil to triumph. And of course, in particular, it is instructive for us to consider that the real barometer of fighting evil is fighting evil to our fellow human beings. And so, in this vein, when we consider the message in Isaiah chapter 58, I feel obliged to note here that chapter 58, which addresses the question, what kind of fast day does God choose, is the passage from the prophets that is read in synagogues on the morning of the fast day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Is not this the fast that I have chosen? Is it devotion to God that is of paramount importance? Candidly, no. To loose the fetters of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, to deal your bread to the hungry, to bring the poor that are cast out to your house, to clothe the naked. Then your righteousness will go before you. The righteousness is calibrated. It is defined by how do you treat your fellow man. This is our mission. This, we should note, the prophet Isaiah tells us in chapter 61, is his mission. God has anointed me to bring good tidings to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the eyes to them that are bound. To act on behalf of people. And that means to proclaim the year of God's good pleasure, the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn. To be active in combating evil in all of its manifestations and to stand up for its victims. That, more than anything else, defines heroism according to the Bible. And that brings me to one final crucial point. I already told you I was going to get back to this. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Why was it so crucial for him to see that there was no man? In the Hebrew, Vayav ki ein ish. It is instructive to consider that we find the exact same expression, Vayav ki ein ish. He saw there was no man, in a completely different context. In Isaiah chapter 59, the prophet describes a dire state of affairs. Truth is lacking. He who departs from evil makes himself a prey or is considered mad. And God saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no intercessor. Therefore his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness it sustained him. And he put on righteousness as a coat of mail, and a helmet of salvation upon his head. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and was clad with zeal as a cloak. God acting. God bringing salvation to the downtrodden. God wreaking vengeance upon the wicked. Why? Because he saw there was no man. No one else is doing what needs to be done. And of course, here significantly we note the attitude of the true hero. Conceivably, given the manner in which the Greek hero is described, he'd have looked around to make sure that someone was watching, because if he wants to make a name for himself, he needs an audience. The hero of the Bible not only isn't seeking an audience, but rather he seeks confirmation that there is no man. Why? Because if there is, maybe someone else is going to do the job instead. I'm not looking for an opportunity to make a big splash, to get the headlines. If someone else is already engaging in the task, then evidently it's his mission. I need to seek a different mission. But if I look around, I look this way and that, and I saw there was no man, then evidently this is the mission that's waiting for me. I need to be the man. I need to act, if you will, emulating God. When God sees there is no man, God does it. So too we, when we see there's no man, we are obliged to act. Likewise, in Isaiah chapter 63, and here the theme of salvation and vengeance is even more palpable. Who is it who comes from Edom with crimson garments from Botzrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, stately in the greatness of his strength. I who speak with righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like his who treads in a wine vat? I have trodden the winepress alone, and of all the peoples there was no man with me. There's no one there. No one standing in the breach. No one committed to battling wickedness. So I trode them in my anger and trampled them in my fury. For the day of vengeance that was in my heart and my year of redemption are come. And again. And I looked, and there was none to help. And I beheld in astonishment, and there was none to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation unto me, and my fury it upheld me. You do what's right when no one else is doing what's right. You're not seeking an audience. It's irrelevant. But the true hero obsesses on not abiding by evil, not abiding by wickedness, doing, acting, acting in doing God's work as He charges us, in fulfilling God's mission as He has endowed us. That is true heroism. And of course, inevitably, at this juncture, I can't help but note that there is an obvious connection of our conclusion this evening to our conclusion last week. Again, I reiterate it. It's not about what you accomplish. It's about what are you doing. And this crucial question of what are you doing? Are you doing God's work as He has guided you, as He has commanded you, as He has bidden you? Or are you kind of sitting it out and saying, well, I'll just be righteous and I won't be doing anything wrong, but I'm not really going to do anything positive either? That is the crucial question in evaluating our own fate. Are we indeed living up to the mandate that was the basis of God bringing us into the world? For Moses to be Moses, we need, before anything else, before any divine revelation to be introduced to him, here, first, with the stories of his forebears and formative influences, showing themselves as heroes. And second, his own acts of heroism in doing what is right. It is exclusively on that basis that Moses becomes Moses. May we too, in our own smaller or greater way, grow into ourselves, be who we are called upon to be by doing what is right, rather than seeking names for ourselves to discover our true identities in fulfilling the mission that God has given us and doing His works as He has guided us and shown us the way. God bless you.